It was the morning of August 23rd, 1305, when London awoke to a grim spectacle, one destined to carve its mark deeply into the pages of history. As dawn broke, the city's streets swelled with an ever-growing crowd. Merchants shuttered there, stalls nobles descended from their chambers, and common folk poured in from every alley and corner. They weren't drawn by the usual lure of bread or ale, but by a far darker curiosity, the promise of witnessing a man's final. Brutal moments in the distance, a chilling sound cut through the morning air, the grinding scrape of wood against stone, the clip-clop of hooves, and something far more sinister, the harsh dragging of flesh scraping over rough cobblestones. A crimson trail, stark and relentless, marked the path of a man bound naked to a wooden hurdle. William Wallace, the symbol of Scottish defiance and freedom, was being dragged through the heart of London. His body bore the marks of a long and brutal journey from Scotland, each mile a fresh wound etched into his skin. His flesh hung in tatters, his back a cruel mosaic of pain and suffering. Yet, amid this ruin, his eyes blazed unyielding, fierce, defiant. Despite the crowd's venomous jeers and the filth they hurled, Wallace refused to break. This was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary moment. To truly grasp the depth of what awaited Wallace in those final hours, we must travel back 3.5 decades to a Scotland that once knew peace. The year was 1270. In the lush, rolling hills of Renfrew, a child was born into the household of Sir Malcolm Wallace, a minor landowner content with tending his fields and serving his lord. This boy was named William. No one could have guessed then that he would grow to become a man who would strike fear into the heart of the most powerful king in Europe. William grew strong and tall in the shadow of the Scottish Highlands. Unlike most men of his class, he learned to read and write studying Latin alongside monks and developed a mind as keen as any sword he might wield. By his 20th year, he was a towering figure, nearly 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the hopes of a nation and hands strong enough to wield a massive 6-foot sword with deadly skill. Scotland in William's youth was a land of prosperity and peace. King Alexander III ruled wisely, and under his reign markets thrived, harvests flourished, and people slept without fear. But fate, ever cruel and unpredictable, had other plans. In 1286, on a stormy night worthy of legend, King Alexander III met his death after falling from his horse near his passing shattered Scotland's golden age. The throne passed to Margaret, the maid of Norway, a 3-year-old child who had never set foot on Scottish soil. For 4 precarious years, Scotland teetered on the edge of chaos, ruled by regents, and tangled in political intrigue. Then, in 1290, young Margaret died on her voyage to claim the crown, plunging Scotland into a leaderless void. Into this chaos stepped Edward I of England, known as Longshanks for his towering height in an era of short men. Edward was a fierce warrior king, hardened by decades of conquest in Wales and battle on crusades in the Holy Land. When the Scottish nobles, desperate to avoid civil war, invited him to arbitrate their succession dispute, they unknowingly welcomed a wolf into their midst. Edward chose John Balliol, a weak king he believed he could control. But Edward's ambitions went far beyond puppetry. He demanded homage from Scottish nobles, imposed English courts on Scottish disputes, and forced Scottish knights to fight in his wars abroad. Each demand tightened the noose around Scotland's neck. By 1296, even Balliol had had enough. He renounced his allegiance to Edward and sought alliances with France, declaring Scotland's independence. Edward's response was swift and brutal. His armies swept over the border like a plague, laying siege to towns and cities. The first to fall was Berwick-upon-Tweed massacre, so savage it burned itself into Scottish memory. English soldiers showed no mercy, slaughtering men, women, and children alike. Chronicles speak of rivers running red with blood, bodies piled like firewood, and an eerie silence so profound even the ravens refused to sing. 17,000 souls were lost, the day victims of geography and fate. This was the Scotland that shaped William Wallace, a land battered and broken, yet unbowed. When Edward stripped Balliol of his crown, forced him into humiliating penance, and declared himself overlord of Scotland, young William watched from the shadows, as nobles bent the knee and pledged fealty to their conqueror. Wallace's anger grew. English officials parcelled out Scottish lands to their cronies, treating a proud kingdom like spoils of war. Something inside William snapped a spark that would ignite a rebellion. In May of 1297, Wallace crossed a point of no return. The exact cause is lost to time. Some say the murder of his beloved Marion Brayfoot, others a growing fury at endless injustice. Whatever the trigger, Wallace drew his sword against William Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark. That act sent shockwaves through the occupied land. At last, someone dared to fight back. Men began to vanish from their fields and workshops, slipping into forests and hills to join Wallace's growing band of rebels. But Wallace was no mere outlaw. He brought to the fight a sharp mind and an unshakable belief in Scotland's right to freedom. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a higher calling. "We fight not for glory or riches," he thundered, "but for freedom alone, which no good man loses but with his life." That autumn, Wallace faced the full fury of England's might at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Outnumbered Scots to 15,000 English facing Europe's finest heavy cavalry, the odds were terrifying. English commanders John de Warenne and Hugh de Cressingham were so confident they treated the battle like a mere exercise. From the high ground of Abbey Craig, Wallace waited patiently as the English forces slowly crossed the narrow bridge. Long, vulnerable column of cavalry, infantry, and baggage trains. Any ordinary commander would have attacked immediately. But Wallace understood the power of timing. When exactly half the English army had crossed, he gave the signal. The Scots surged down like a thunderstorm war, cries ringing as the river trapped the English forces, splitting them in two. The bridge became a bottleneck of terror. Soldiers trampled their own comrades in desperate flight. Hugh de Cressingham, Edward's cruel treasurer, fell early. In a grim act of vengeance, Scots flayed his corpse, making belts and purses from his skinner, grotesque symbol of their rage. By day's end, the supposedly invincible English army lay shattered. William Wallace was no longer a rebel. Overnight, he became a national hero, the guardian of Scotland, its de facto ruler. For a brief moment, it seemed David had truly slain Goliath. Wallace led raids deep into northern England, returning the brutality visited on Scotland tenfold. English villagers fled as Scottish warriors burned homes and fields. The message was clear. If Wallace could defeat England's best, anything was possible. But Edward Longshanks was no ordinary foe. The man who had conquered Wales and fought in the Holy Land would not forgive such humiliation. He abandoned his campaigns in France, recalled his finest knights, and began assembling an army with one purpose: the total destruction of William Wallace. The two armies met again at Falkirk. On July 22nd, 1298, this time King Edward I took no chances. He had learned much from the defeat at Stirling Bridge. He had studied William Wallace's tactics carefully and was determined to crush the Scottish rebellion with overwhelming force. Wallace, for all his skill and courage, faced an impossible task. His army was mostly made up of common spearmen, poorly trained and lightly equipped. Against them stood the finest English knights, battle-hardened warriors, supported by deadly Welsh longshoremen. These archers were masters of their craft, their arrows capable of piercing armor from 200 yards away. The battle quickly turned into a massacre. The Scottish schiltrons, dense, circular formations of spearmen with pikes pointed outward, like giant hedgehogs, held strong against the fierce cavalry charges. But the longbowmen rained arrows down upon them relentlessly. Thousands of sharp shafts tore through the packed ranks, sending men crashing to the ground in agony. Their screams were swallowed by the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel. When the schiltrons finally broke, the English cavalry poured in like a flood breaking through a dam. Among the fallen was John de Graham, Wallace's closest friend and most trusted lieutenant. He fought fiercely to the last breath, his body riddled with wounds. The Scottish army collapsed, the field strewn with the dead. Wallace himself barely escaped, his dreams of Scottish independence crushed beneath the weight of English steel. Falkirk marked the beginning of the darkest chapter in his life. Forced to step down as guardian of Scotland, abandoned by nobles who now saw him as a danger. Rather than a leader, he became a man without a country. Some say he traveled to France, seeking support from King Philip IV against Edward. Others claim he went to Rome, pleading Scotland's cause before Pope Boniface VIII. What we know for sure is that William Wallace vanished, becoming a ghost, a legend whispered about in taverns but never seen. Years passed, other men took up the fight. Robert the Bruce, once a collaborator with the English, began his own campaign for the crown. John Comyn, Wallace's rival, made peace with the occupiers. Scotland's nobility, ever practical, adapted to English rule, but Edward Longshanks did not forget. Somewhere in the shadows lurked William Wallace, the man who had humiliated him at Stirling Bridge, until Wallace was dead. England's victory was incomplete. That end came in August 1305, not on the battlefield, but through the basest betrayal. John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had sold his loyalty for English gold, lured Wallace to a meeting near Glasgow. Whether with promises of aid or information, it mattered little. Wallace, worn down by years on the run and desperate to strike back, walked into a trap that would cost him everything. When English soldiers surrounded him, Wallace's first instinct was to fight, but he was alone, outnumbered, and exhausted. The giant who once stormed battlefields like a force of nature found himself chained in Capsuda, prize for his greatest enemy. The journey to London was as much about humiliation as transport. Wallace was dragged through town after town, displayed like a captured beast. Children threw stones, adults hurled curses and filth. With each painful mile, he moved further from the land he loved and closer to the horrors awaiting him. Edward could have simply hanged Wallace a quick death, to silence Scotland's hero forever. But he had a darker purpose. He wanted a spectacle so terrifying, so brutal, that it would crush the spirit of rebellion for generations. Every Scot would know the terrible cost of defying English rule. Westminster Hall, the great seat of English justice, became the stage for Wallace's final act. This vast hall, with its soaring oak roof and stone walls adorned with royal heraldry, stood as a monument to English power. There, surrounded by symbols of authority, Wallace faced his accusers. The charges were serious, though to many they would have seemed laughable. Treason, though Wallace never swore allegiance to Edward. Murder and robbery, though his victims were occupying soldiers, and his spoils used to fund Scotland's fight. Sacrilege, though his only crime was refusing to bow to a false king. When given the chance to speak, Wallace's voice rang out with fierce clarity. "I cannot be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject. I owe him no allegiance. He is not my king." His words sealed his fate, though the verdict had been decided long before he entered the hall. The judges pronounced a sentence so cruel it defied belief. William Wallace was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Even in medieval England, known for its brutal punishments, this was the ultimate torment, reserved for traitors and deemed too vile for women. It was designed not just to kill, but to utterly destroy. The condemned man would suffer death after death, each more agonizing than the last, until nothing remained but broken pieces for the ravens. On the grey, oppressive morning of August 23rd, 1305, London thrummed with grim anticipation. Venters hawked meat pies and ale to the crowds. Nobles jockeyed for the best viewing spots. Children who should have been in school pressed forward, eager for a glimpse of the famed prisoner. The air itself seemed thick with bloodlust at Westminster Hall. William Wallace was stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdler-crude sledge once used to drag heavy loads. The message was clear. He was no longer a man deserving dignity, but mere cargo to be hauled to his doom. A rope was tied around his feet and fastened to a horse's harness. When the animal lurched forward, Wallace's body began its final, terrible journey through London's streets. Every cobblestone became an instrument of torture. His flesh, weakened from months of imprisonment, tore away in strips as he was dragged across the rough stones. His head bounced violently against the ground, blood streaming from countless wounds, leaving a crimson trail eagerly lapped up by dogs. The crowd followed like a diseased wave, their jeers and curses mixing with the sickening scrape of flesh on stone. The procession wound through London's narrow streets for what felt like hours, past the great cathedral of St. Paul's, where priests crossed themselves and looked away in sorrow, past bustling markets, where merchants abandoned stalls to join the jeering mob, past noble homes, where residents watched with a mix of fascination and disgust. Wallace drifted in and out of consciousness, his body a symphony of agony. Still, his lips moved, perhaps prayers, perhaps curses. Finally, Smithfield the execution ground spread before them like an amphitheatre of death. Known as the Elms for its towering trees, it had witnessed countless executions, but none as cruel as this. A platform stood in the centre, surrounded by crude wooden barriers to hold back the crowd. Ropes and pulleys dangled like the rigging of a hellish ship. Braziers burned hot, their flames dancing with grim anticipation. The executioner waited beside his tool's knot, a butcher eager for a quick kill, but a craftsman skilled in prolonging suffering. His task was not merely to end Wallace's life, but to stage a torment that would be remembered for centuries. The first phase began swiftly. Wallace, barely conscious from his ordeal, was hauled upright beneath the gallows. A thick hemp rope ruff and corsewars looped around his neck with practiced efficiency. The crowd fell silent, their bloodlust momentarily sated by the promise of the next horror. But this was no ordinary hanging. There would be no swift drop to break his neck and bring quick death. Instead, Wallace was slowly hoisted into the air, his feet dangling inches from the ground. The rope tightened around his throat, cutting off his breath but not his blood flow. The agony had only just begun. His body convulsed violently, struggling desperately for air that would not come. His face turned purple, then blue, eyes bulging as the pressure inside his skull mounted unbearably. The crowd watched with morbid fascination as Wallace's powerful frame writhed and spasmed. Some cheered with cruel delight at each convulsion, while others placed bets on how long he would survive. Children, lifted onto their father's shoulders, pointed and laughed at the dancing man. Minutes passed long, terrible minutes where Wallace hovered on the razor's edge between life and death. His brain starved of oxygen, his heart still stubbornly beating. Just as unconsciousness began to claim him, the executioner gave a signal. Wallace was lowered back to the platform. The noose slackened just enough to allow precious air to fill his lungs again. His body spasmed as he gasped desperately, his chest heaving like a bellows. But there was no mercy, no peaceful fading into darkness. The worst was still to come. The second phase, the drawing, or disembowelment, began while Wallace still struggled to breathe. Sharp knives flashed in the morning sun as the executioner made the first precise cuts. The blade slid beneath Wallace's ribs, opening his abdomen from sternum to pelvis. Blood poured onto the platform, forming steaming crimson pools in the cool air. Wallace's eyes snapped open, the searing pain slicing through his semi-consciousness like lightning. A scream tore from his throat, raw and desperate, though his damaged larynx could only produce a strangled wheeze. His body arched violently against the ropes binding him as the executioner reached inside. His cavity with practiced hands that what followed defied human endurance. With the methodical patience of a surgeon, the executioner began removing Wallace's internal organs while he still lived. First the stomach, uncoiling like a grey snake as it was pulled free. Then the intestines, yard after yard of them, and steaming as they were dragged into the open air. The crowd roared its approval with each gruesome trophy held aloft before being thrown onto the waiting fires. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the metallic temps of blood and the acrid smoke rising from the braziers. Many in the crowd covered their faces with cloth, but none looked away. This was a spectacle beyond their wildest imaginings, a brutal display of state power that reduced a man to his very components, while thousands watched and cheered. But even this was not the end of Wallace's torment. The final indignity. The executioner's blade flashed one last time. With a single efficient cut, Wallace's manhood was severed. The crowd's roar reached a fever pitch as the bloody trophy was held aloft before being thrown into the flames. The symbolism was clear. This was the fate of anyone who dared challenge English authority. Amazingly, Wallace still lived. His body, hollowed and broken, fought for each breath. Though his eyes were clouded with pain and approaching death, they still held that defiant spark that had carried him through years of struggle. Even now, as his life ebbed away drop by drop, William Wallace refused to break. The final act, the quartering, was postponed until death finally claimed him. But when death came, it came not in surrender, but almost in triumph. Wallace's lips moved one last time, forming words only he could hear. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse on his enemies, perhaps simply the name of the land he died trying to free Scotland. When the great heart finally stopped beating, the executioner stepped forward to complete his grisly task. Sharp axes rose and fell with mechanical precision, severing limbs from torso with wet, meaty sounds that echoed across the suddenly silent field. The proud head never bowed to English rule, was severed with a single stroke, and held high for All to see, the crowd, sated at last, began to disperse. But Wallace's journey was not over. His head was preserved in tar to prevent decay and mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, the first head ever displayed on that famous crossing. His 4 limbs were sent to the corners of his homeland, one to Newcastle, one to Berwick, one to Stirling, and one to Perth. Each served as a grisly warning to anyone who might follow Wallace's example. Edward Longshanks believed he had won the ultimate victory. The man who dared defy him was not only killed, but obliterated, his body scattered to the winds like dust. Surely, the king thought, no one who witnessed such a fate would risk the same. Surely the Scottish spirit was broken forever. But tyrants throughout history have failed to grasp a fundamental truth about martyrdom. The death of the body can give birth to something far more powerful than any man, even as Wallace's remains rotted on spikes. Something stirred in the Scottish heart. The brutality of his execution, far from cowing the people, ignited a fury that would burn for generations. Within months of Wallace's death, Robert the Bruce murdered his rival John Comyn in a church and declared himself King of Scotland. The wars of independence, far from ending, entered a new and even more savage phase. At battles like Lothian Hill and Bannockburn, Scottish warriors carried Wallace's name into battle like a banner. It became their war cry, striking terror into English hearts. Edward Longshanks himself would never see Scotland subdued. He died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace's execution. His final command, allegedly, was for his son to boil the flesh from his bones and carry it at the head of every English army until Scotland was conquered. But Edward, too, proved weak and ineffective. Under his leadership, the English grip on Scotland loosened and eventually snapped entirely. The final irony came in 1320, when Scottish nobles gathered to sign the Declaration of Arbroath Paps, the finest statement of national independence ever penned. Its words echoed with the defiant spirit Wallace had carried to his death. As long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honours, that we fight, but for freedom, for that alone which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. William Wallace never lived to see his dream fulfilled, but his sacrifice planted the seeds that eventually blossomed into freedom. His execution, intended as the ultimate display of English power, instead became the catalyst for everything Edward Longshanks sought to prevent. In the end, that was Wallace's true victory. The man who died in agony at Smithfield, his body torn apart and scattered, achieved through death what he could not in life. He became immortal not in flesh, but in the undying spirit of a people who refused to bow to any master but their own choosing. Today, more than 7 centuries after that grim morning in London, William Wallace's name still stirs hearts and quickens pulses. His story is retold with each generation, inspiring those who face impossible odds, who stand alone against overwhelming power, who refuse to compromise their principles even when the cost is everything. The body that was brutally destroyed has long since returned to dust. But the idea it represented that freedom is worth any sacrifice, that some principles are worth dying for, burns as brightly as ever. Standing in modern-day Smithfield, watching the busy streets flow past the memorial plaque marking the spot where Wallace died, one cannot help but wonder what he would think of his legacy. Would he be pleased that his death sparked the revolution he sought? Would he be amazed to learn his name is still spoken with reverence in the land he loved above all else? Perhaps the answer lies not in speculation, but in the simple fact that we still remember in an age where fame is fleeting and heroes are quickly forgotten. William Wallace endures. His brutal execution was meant to end his story. Instead, it began a legend that will outlive empires, a testament to the power of the human spirit to triumph even in defeat. In dying as he lived, unbroken, unbowed, utterly defiant, William Wallace achieved the only victory that truly matters. He became immortal. And so the ghost of that tall man from Renfrewshire still walks among us, reminding us that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In every act of courage against impossible odds, every stand taken for principle over convenience, every refusal to bow to unjust authority, the spirit of William Wallace lives on. The body they courted and scattered has long since returned to dust, but the dream he died for, the dream of freedom, burns eternal.